Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be a very power packed section because our exam time is too near, and it's going to be a quick yet comprehensive overview of key literary critics starting from Plato to postmodernism, and each entry it will be a one-liner packed with meaning, followed by very brief yet insightful explanation about some of the works and some of the critics. So without much delay, let's begin our ultimate revision of literary criticism. So let's begin our session on literary criticism from classical criticism. And the first critic that we are going to come across is Plato. So Plato had said that art is an imitation of an imitation, because Plato believed in an ideal world of forms. For him, all art is twice removed from the reality or truth, we can say, because it imitates life, which is itself an imitation of the ideal state. And he famously wanted poets banned from his ideal republic. And this concept was that the concept of art is an imitation of an imitation is the concept of mimesis as we know today. And he believes that poets mislead society by appealing to emotions rather than reason, and this is not acceptable in his republic world. And as we have already discussing his famous work, The Republic, where he proposes banishing poets from the ideal state, because he condemns poetry as thinking that the poetry is fostering some evil habits and vices in human lives. And he objected on the ground that poetry does not cultivate good habits among children, among people. So he says that poetry does not lead to but drives us away from the realization of the ultimate reality or the truth that we are saying. Next is Aristotle. So Aristotle said that his beliefs are completely opposite to Plato. He believes that poetry is more philosophical than history, and he has given a concept of tragedy. Let's discuss it. So he had said that poetry is more philosophical than history because, unlike Plato, Aristotle valued poetry for expressing some universal truth. And in his Poetics, the famous work, he has argued that tragedy evokes pity and fear to achieve the emotion catharsis, making poetry very emotionally and intellectually rich. And you should look also every form of tragedy, catharsis, peripetia, anagarsis, hamartia, havis. These are these terms that you should know definitely. If you haven't, I'm just giving you an insight so that you can go and look into Aristotle's every term very carefully, because it's important for exam. And I have posted a video in YouTube based on Plato and Aristotle. You can go and check that out in the channel if you want a full lecture on Plato and Aristotle. Okay. Next comes Horace. So Horace thought is so beautiful. Like, he says that poetry should both delight and instruct. So in his famous work Ars Poetica, Horace emphasized that art should not only entertain but also it should morally guide people. He stressed that decorum and proper form in classical genres should be established. And as we discussed, he emphasizes mostly on decorum and rules for different genres of work. Okay. Next is Longinus. So Longinus says that sublime elevates the soul. What does it mean? Longinus highlighted that the emotional and spiritual power of great literature. He listed 5 sources of sublimity, that how we can achieve sublime in life. First, greatness of thought. Second, we should have strong emotion. Third, we should have some noble diction. Fourth, we should have a proper arrangement. And the last, in the fifth, we should have a dignified language. So he says that emotional and spiritual power of great literature, he believes in that, and he listed 5 sources of sublimity, how we can achieve sublimity. Okay, this is all about the classical criticism, where we have discussed about Plato, Aristotle, Horace, and Longinus. And if you want some more details about these critics, then you can take help of Google, or I have already posted a video on Plato and Aristotle. You can go and check that out. After classical criticism comes the medieval and Renaissance criticism, that we can say. And the first critic was Dante. So Dante's first one-liner, that is poetry, has multiple levels, that is literal, allegorical, moral, and analogical. Let's explain it. Let me explain this whole one line for you. So in medieval thought, especially in Dante's Divine Comedy, poetry was seen as very layered with meanings, and each of these meanings, they reflect a deeper spiritual or moral truth. Next is Boccaccio. So he says that poetry is divinely inspired and morally enriching and instructive. For example, we can say that Boccaccio, like Dante, he defended poetry as a very noble endeavor, one that can guide the human behavior through some imaginative storytelling. That's why he said that poetry is divinely inspired and morally it can be instructive and enriching. Third, the most famous Renaissance critic, Sir Philip Sidney. So, Sir Philip Sidney said that poet is a creator, not a mere imitator. And his two works, that is the Defense of Poesy and Apology for Poetry. So we can see that Sidney's writings of the Apology as a defense of poetry was originally occasioned by an attack on poetry entitled The School of Abuse, published in 1579 by a Puritan minister, Stephen Gosson, and he has written the Apology of Poetry as a reaction to it. So as mentioned earlier, Sidney rejected this Gosson's whole Protestant attack on courtly pleasure by effectively defending poetry as a very virtuous activity for the aristocratic people. So Sidney says that poetry is the first light giver to ignorance. Okay. So he says that in Apology for Poetry, he asserted that poets, they don't just copy nature, they imagine the ideal worlds by making them superior to both historians and philosophers. So he says that neither philosopher nor any historiographer could be the first that has entered into the gates of this popular judgment if they had not taken a great passport of poetry. So this is the whole thing that is quoted in his work, An Apology for Poetry. So he says that poetry combines the virtue of history and philosophy in his most famous work, The Apology for Poetry. Now comes the neoclassical criticism, and the first writer was John Dryden. So first, John Dryden, Samuel Johnson hailed him and called him the father of literary criticism, and he has written a most famous work, Essay on Metaphysics and an essay of dramatic poesy, and mostly questions were being asked from an essay of dramatic poesy, because he had said that that he has in this work, an essay of dramatic poesy, he has blended French order with English creativity. So Dryden has admired the rules and formality of French drama, but also it celebrated the liveliness of English drama. He also argued for balance and clarity in literature. So in an essay of dramatic poesy, this whole treatise is a dialogue between four speakers, Crites, who represents or who favors the classical drama. You should remember it because questions are being asked from this particular part of an essay of dramatic poesy, like who favors whom, who has adopted this character of Crites. So I'm just saying that to you. Crites, Sir Robert Howard, who was Dryden's brother-in-law, has favored the classical drama. Next is Eugenius, who was this character of Lord Buckhurst, who favored the modern drama. Next is Lycidius, who was Sir Charles Sedley, who favored the French drama. Next is Neander, who was Dryden himself, and Neander means new man who favors the English drama. So this whole thing he had said that mostly it blends the whole purpose of this and essay of dramatic poesy was that it blends French order with English creativity, because Dryden has admired the rules and formality of the French drama, but also he has celebrated and not forgotten the liveliness of the English drama. So he has argued for the balance and clarity in literature of both of them. Next is Alexander Pope. So Alexander Pope has always been a believer of nature. So he has said that nature is the standard of judgment in Essay on Criticism. So he has written some of the work, Essay on Man, which was dedicated to S.T. John. You should remember it. Next is an Essay on Criticism. So in Essay on Criticism, he had said that he has favored verse over prose, means poetry over prose, and encouraged the poets to imitate the ancient poets such as Horace, Longinus, Homer, Quintilian, because he believes that ancient poets are equal to the nature. So to imitate the ancient poets means to imitate the nature. So that's why he has always been in the favor of nature. And one of the most famous quote from Essay on Criticism was, "To err is human, to forgive divine." And some other quotations I am telling you: "Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. A little learning is dangerous thing. Our judgments, like our watches, none go just like, yet each believes his own." These are some of the most famous quotes that have been asked in exams, so you should remember it. Next, he has written a work, Moral Essays, and I think 2 times questions have been asked from this particular essay. So there are 4 moral essays written by Pope. That is Epistle to Cobham, second Epistle to a Lady, third Epistle to Bathurst, fourth Epistle to Burlington. If I have not mentioned everything in this presentation, but if you want, you can pause the video and write everything by listening it once again. Okay. Next is Samuel Johnson. So Samuel Johnson has said that literature should appeal to reason and morality. So he has always been a practical believer that that poetry, this whole criticism, it has some practical impact of literature on reader, and he has emphasized on common sense, moral values, and practicality in literature. So John emphasized common sense, human nature, and literary tradition. He has always believed that readers' experience and work's ethical value were important, they were paramount. So he has been always a believer of that. And in another work, I have not mentioned here, but I just remember it now. In his another work, The Preface to Shakespeare, he has said that Shakespeare's character are just a representation of human nature, as they deal with passion and principle which are common to humanity. So he believes that Shakespeare's histories are neither tragedy nor comedy, and one of the fault of Shakespeare, he has mentioned that Shakespeare writes without moral purpose, and it is more careful to please than to instruct, because this is a question that have been asked in the exam. So you should remember that Samuel Johnson is the person who has said that Shakespeare writes without any moral purpose and he is more careful to please than to instruct. So there is no poetic justice in his place. You should remember about all these critics who falls under the neoclassical criticism. So after neoclassical criticism comes the romantic criticism, and the first writer that we are going to discuss under, the first critic that we are going to discuss under romantic criticism was going to be William Wordsworth. And William Wordsworth one famous quote that is regarding poetry, regarding poem, is that he has said poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So he has written a work, Preface to Lyrical Ballad. The first preface was published, the first edition was published in 1798. The second edition was published in 1801. So he had said that poetry has all the beauty of the knowledge, and he says that a poet is a man speaking to man. And in the Preface to Lyrical Ballad, Wordsworth has emphasized that emotion is recollected in tranquility, and he used the language of common people to democratize poetry. Or he says the language of poetry should be the language of what a common man actually speaks. And he says that when you believe in solitude, when you remain in tranquility, the thought process that happens in your mind, the things that comes to your mind, that he considered as poetry. He says that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings that is recollected in tranquility. Next, we have S.T. Coleridge and his famous work, the Biographia Literaria, which was published in 1817. So he said that Coleridge, some of the writers and critics believed that Coleridge was the first English critic to build literary criticism on a very philosophical foundation. So Coleridge's Biographia Literaria is his most famous, significant literary work, and it will focus mainly on how Coleridge has distinguished between, he has discussed about fancy, imagination, about all these things. And he has said that imagination is the supreme poetic faculty. So he has discussed in the 4th chapter of the Biographia Literaria about fancy and imagination, from which questions were being asked. Okay, so he has said that he has suggested between a difference between fancy and imagination, which was very contrary to the belief that we have, that these are two distinct and widely different faculties. But then he says that imagination was considered either as primary or secondary. Imagination can be both of type, primary imagination and secondary imagination. And primary imagination is very simple. He says that primary imagination is the thing that the power and the prime agent of what the human is thinking. And the secondary imagination is the echo of the primary imagination, like it coexists with the conscious will, yet it feels very identical with the primary imagination. Okay, so primary imagination was what actually we are thinking. And the fancy, he says that the fancy is nothing. Fancy, if we'll say that imagination is creative and fancy is mechanical. So he says that he has distinguished between fancy means mechanical and imagination means creativity. So he believed in the organic unity of form and content in literature. So he had said that fancy is nothing but only the mode of memory that has been invented, or that has been ignited from the order of time and space, and when it blends with what we actually want in life, what we actual imagination of a human, that becomes the fancy. And he has also talked about another term, that is willing suspension of disbelief, and he said that the willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitute the poetic faith. And by this whole thing, he meant that the reader, he accepts the poem on his own terms by giving over the author's vision of the world long enough to appreciate what the author wants to say. So if I'll say in very simple words, author's work does not have to be realistic, it only has to be believable. Okay, and this is the willing suspension of disbelief, means readers willing suspension of willingly they suspend their disbelief and trust the poet, what the poet actually want to say, known, which we say known to be the poetic faith. And now John Keats. John Keats, one famous term, negative capability, which was coined in 1817. And if I'll explain this, negative capability, John Keats said that it is the capacity of the greatest writers, and he particularly here tells and talks about Shakespeare, to pursue a vision of artistic beauty even when it leads them into intellectual confusion and uncertainty. And he said, and from this negative capability, another term evolved, that is egoistical sublime. Where he says, when the writers who don't have the negative capability, they suffer from this egoistical sublime. Now, what is egoistical sublime? If we'll talk about, he says that this egoistical part comes to when the poets would have interpreted everything that they saw in relation to themselves. Okay, for example, when a poet eats something and he imagines, or a poet sees something beautiful, he imagines that, okay, people will remember this whole scenario after they died. So this idea is everything that is related to the poet and makes them think of themselves, especially if it's beautiful and it's found in nature. Okay, so these are some of the romantic critics you should definitely study before going to the exam. Yes, and another writer I have forgot to mention, that is Percy Bysshe Shelley, who had said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Why? Because Shelley believed that poets shape the society through ideals, dreams, and emotion, even if their power is not officially recognized. After Romantic criticism comes the Victorian criticism, and the first writer was Matthew Arnold. So Matthew Arnold had said that criticism spreads the best that is known and thought. So he has written some works, The Study of Poetry and The Culture and Anarchy. So in The Study of Poetry, he has talked about the touchstone method. He has advocated the touchstone method to evaluate the poetry. So he said that when one reads poetry, he tends to estimate whether it is of the best form or not. And it happens in three ways: the real estimate, the historical estimate, and the personal estimate. So the historical estimate, it places the historical context above the value of the art itself. In the real estimate, it is unbiased viewpoint that takes into account of both historical context and the creativity or the creativity of a reader to judge the worth of the poetry. And the third, that is the personal estimate, was depends on the personal taste. If you are reading a poem, if you actually likes the poem or not. Even if you like the poem, another one may does not like the poem. So these are three estimates based on which the poetry was being judged. And the touchstone method was, he said that he says that the classical poets, they have lacked the high seriousness, and he has believed, he had said that Geoffrey Chaucer was the writer who ultimately lacks this high seriousness of classical poetry. So he had said that touchstone method of analyzing poetry in order to determine whether it is of a high standard, whether the poetry is of high standard or not. And as I said, his another work in Culture and Anarchy, he has talked about a chapter named Sweetness and Light, and this was a question in one of the exam in NET. I think they have asked a question based on this. That's why I have mentioned about Sweetness and Light. And remember that the sequel of Culture and Anarchy is Friendship's Gangland. So in Culture, he has said that it is highly developed state of perfection, having a flawless quality. and anarchy, he says that anarchy is a state of lawless and disorder. Okay, so which usually results from a failure of government. So this was to this culture and anarchy. Matthew Arnold has written it to correct the arrogance of English society. So it's a very political essay, we can say. It's not that important, but as one time, I think 1 to 2 time questions have been asked from this culture and anarchy. That's why I have just mentioned that in culture and anarchy there is a chapter named Sweetness and Light. You should just remember it. Okay. Next is Walter Peter. So Walter Peter has said that art should be appreciated for its beauty alone and he has kind of prioritized this movement, art for art's sake. So Pater has rejected the didacticism and the moral judgment. For him, art's purpose was to create the beauty regardless of ethics or politics. Next is Henry James. So Henry James has written a work in the art of fiction, and in the art of fiction he has argued that restrictive rules for writing fiction makes things difficult, and he has said that these restrictive rules should not be there because no good novel or no good work will ever proceed from a superficial mind. He had said that a true artist will not be able to create any interesting story or interesting work without imbibing some morals into it. So he had said that fiction is far removed from the mere mechanical arts. He has said that it should be flawless, it should be natural to actually believe, to actually see the magic of fiction. Now, in the end comes the modern criticism. So, modern criticism's first critic was T.S. Eliot, who has introduced the concept of impersonality in poetry. He had said that poetry should be impersonal and rooted in tradition. So, in one of his famous works, Tradition and Individual Talent, which was first published in 1919, you should remember it, in The Sacred Wood, Essays on Poetry and Criticism. This was published, it was actually first published, then it was included in The Sacred Wood, Essays on Poetry and Criticism. This was also one of the questions that has been asked in the net. So you should remember it. Okay. So he had said that in Tradition and Individual Talent, Eliot has proposed that a poet's emotion should be depersonalized and shaped by literary history. So he has said that no poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. He says that you cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead, means among the past. You should compare them with the past writers to see the actual worth of a poet. Okay. And next, in his essay, The Metaphysical Poet, Eliot has argued that the metaphysical poet has embodied a fusion of thought and feeling that later poets were unable to achieve because of dissociation of sensibility. Now, if we talk about what is dissociation of sensibility, so dissociation of sensibility, he has explained that dissociation of sensibility is the reason for the difference between the intellectual and a reflective poet. So Eliot has concluded that this metaphysical poet, by drawing some comparison between the metaphysical mode and the 19th century French symbolist, to demonstrate how the metaphysical was not just some it was not just some very different variety of poetry, but it had some core affinities with other schools of poetry as well. So this is all about T.S. Eliot and his theory of impersonality, the dissociation of sensibility. You should definitely remember about all these things before going to the exam. Next is I.A. Richards. So I.A. Richards has said that criticism should focus on reader response and close reading. He has always been a believer of practical criticism. So he said that he has introduced the concept of practical criticism, you should remember it, and he believed that psychological impact of literature was as important as the form and meaning of literature, and he has coined terms like tenor and vehicle in the metaphor. Next, we have F.R. Leavis. So, F.R. Leavis had said that literature should have moral seriousness and tradition. So, Leavis, in his work The Great Tradition, has emphasized about the moral weight of great literature, and he instead insisted on evaluating literature through some ethical seriousness and the human value that should definitely be instilled in a human. Next is Cleanth Brooks. So Cleanth Brooks is a promoter, or he believed in new criticism, and he had said that a poem is a well-wrought urn, a self-contained entity in its soul. So Cleanth Brooks is a key figure in new criticism, and he discouraged the paraphrasing of poetry. He believed that intrinsic value or the inner value of poetic structure, tension, and paradoxes. And he has coined the term the heresy of paraphrase. Next is Northrop Fryer. So Northrop Fryer is he has said that literature follows mythic and archetypical pattern. So Fryer, as we can see, that he was the believer that literature is structured by repeating the cycles and archetypes, by drawing from myths, seasons, and genres. So these are some of the modern critics that you should know, and if you want to go details into these works, then you can read some extra on them, but as of now, at least you should remember about all of these things as the exam is nearing. Now we have some critics from the contemporary criticism or the contemporary literature, and also some of from the cultural studies. I'll be not going too much details into about all of these critics and their works. I'm only going to say one or two work of them. Every work of them are important. You should definitely study them, but the video will get too long and you'll get maybe bored. That's why I'm just going to give you some examples that is very, very important, and the questions that have been repeatedly asked in the exam. Based on that only, I'm going to provide you some explanation based on only one work or two. Okay, the first writer was, or the first critic was, Roland Barthes. So Roland Barthes says that the author is dead and the reader is the true interpreter. So he has explained this in the work Death of the Author, and he has argued that meaning does not reside in the author's intent, but it is created by the reader. So you should, whenever a reader is reading a work, he should consider the author as dead, and he should interpret the work based on his thought, based on what he is thinking while reading the work. Okay, that's why Roland Barthes has written a work, Death of the Author. Next is Jacques Derrida. As we know that Jacques Derrida was a deconstruction critic, and he believes that deconstruction shows that texts undermine their own meaning. So Derrida revealed that language is inherently stable, and he believes that words differ meaning and binaries collapse under this scrutiny, leading to endless interpretation of a particular work. Suppose I am reading a particular work through a particular kind of lens, but whenever someone else is reading that particular work, maybe they are reading that work from some other kind of lenses. They are seeing that particular work through some other eyes. Okay, so that's why so many meanings have been created can be created of a particular work. So he says deconstruction reveals the instability of meaning. Next is Michel Foucault. So Michel Foucault says that knowledge and power are inseparable. I'll tell you how. Okay, so Foucault believed that discourse is controlled by institution and how language enforces this social power. If you'll read every work of Michel Foucault, you'll know that how he has explained about power and discourse and how it has helped to shape the meaning. Next is Michel Bakhtin. So Michel Bakhtin has said that language, all kind of language actually, all language is dialogic and heteroglossic. So Bakhtin saw every text as a conversation between multiple voices. Okay, it may be cultural, historical, and social. It's not just signified. It is not signified, means it is not a single unified voice. Okay. Next is Elaine Walter. So Elaine Walter had said that let's build a female literary tradition. So she was a female critic. So she coined the term the gynocriticism. You should remember it. Elaine Walter has coined the term gynocriticism, the study of women as writers by creating a canon that resists the male-centered interpretation. So she has coined the term gynocriticism, and she was the believer of women literary history. Next is Edward Said. So Edward Said has said the West created the Orient to dominate it. So in Orientalism, a famous work of Edward Said has argued that Western literature and academia has misinterpreted the East to justify the colonial rule. So you should know about Edward Said, this particular work, Orientalism, because questions, most of the time questions have been asked from this Edward Said, this particular work, Orientalism. Okay. Next is Homi Bhabha, and he has given two terms, that is hybridity and mimicry. So I am telling you, he has said that colonial identities are hybrid, not pure. So Bhabha has introduced ideas like mimicry and the third space, and he shows, particularly these two terms, they shows how colonized people, they have resisted and reshaped the colonial power under which they have been dominating themselves. Okay. Next is Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. So one of the famous work, Can the Subaltern Speak?, where Spivak challenged the dominant discourse by pointing out how the voice of marginalized, especially of the colonized women, are often how they are being silenced. So this is the whole theme of the Can the Subaltern Speak?, the work of Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. In the end, the last critic that we are going to discuss is Terry Eagleton. So Terry Eagleton has said that literature is shaped by ideology and history. So Terry Eagleton is a Marxist critic, and as a believer of Marxism, Eagleton argued that literature reflects class struggle, power structure, and the socio-economic realities of its time. So you should definitely remember and study about all these works that falls under the contemporary criticism or the postmodern criticism that we can say. So this is all about your one-stop revision guide to literary criticism. I have tried to include every actual important things that you should definitely study before going to the exam, and I have tried to make it in a very simplified and structure through some memorable one-liners and brief analysis, so that if someone at least haven't studied anything by looking at this video, by studying from this video, at least he'll get some slightest idea before going to the exam. And also those who have been looking for revision, this can be your ultimate revision guide of literary criticism, I can say. So whether you are preparing for UGC NET exam or any other exam, any other upcoming exam that you have, PGT exam or the MPPSC exams. This is going to be a very smooth guide for all of you. So if you all like to this video, then don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel, and also please share it with your friends so that they'll also get benefited from this video. And stay tuned for more perfect literature insights like this. I am going to see you all in a next video. Till then, be safe and keep loving literature.